I want to thank President King for that generous introduction. I hope she doesn't mind me calling her Joyce during the talk.
Not at all.
She's given me approval. I want to say this at the beginning. When she called me about doing this talk, she caught me at an extremely low point. For the past 13 years of my life, I have been studying metropolitan St. Louis and the life chances of African American youth in that community. And we had obviously the tragic loss of a young man in Ferguson. And it just seemed like it was snowballing every time I picked up a newspaper or, God forbid, get on Facebook and someone has posted another situation where an African American person falls victim to police engagement. And to be frank with you, I was beginning to lose hope. And then Joyce called in her really upbeat way and said she needed me to do something, and it was to give this talk. And as I began to ponder it, I realized that the timing wasn't accidental because I was at a low point. And it was about research and development and doing something on behalf of the people in that community. So today, I hope I represent well the lives of the young people that live in that community. I will say this, the work that I've been doing over the last 13 years has never been alone. I don't know if this is actually going to work. No, let's go back. It's been funded by the National Science Foundation, Washington University. I've had many fine collaborators. I won't mention them all by name, but I just want to show it's really been a team effort with colleagues from psychiatry, graduate students in education who put up with me for a few years. We won't give how long they've been there, but long enough that we began to build relationships. I want to have say a special thank you to a couple people, Mark Hogerby, who has been a great colleague working on GIS issues, as well as my colleague for the Sake of All project, Jason Purnell, just really tremendous collaborators and have helped inform my thinking. They take no fault in any errors I make today. They've tried their darndest to help me. So let me tell you what I've been trying to do. And you have to have some questions that guide your work. In my case, I've been attempting to understand, in the context of a place-based analysis, what are the configurations of political capacity, policies, programs, and professionals that result in traditionally underserved youth actually having a shot at it in life, simply stated. And then what I attempt to understand is how aligned are what we say we want to be in a community with what we do with the people who are indigenous to the community, which is the theme of this year's AERA meeting. So that's why I really perked up when Joyce called about this, because I knew this is what we've been thinking about. So in St. Louis, we claim we want to be the biotechnology hub of the United States. When I lived in Dallas, we claimed we wanted to be the telecommunications hub of the United States. So the canonical question is, if you claim you want to do that, what are you doing with the people who actually live in the community, indigenous to the community? Are they part of the plan? Right? Because I know it's easy to get visas to bring people in from abroad. It's easy to invest in certain communities and not others. There's a lot of things that can happen when you think about this kind of work. And finally, what are the costs and benefits associated with success? And I would also say, what are the costs and benefits associated with failure? We need to really frame things in cost-benefit terms, and that's what we've been attempting to do collectively as a group. And so today, I'm really going to focus in on metropolitan St. Louis. But before I launch into that, you can't be at Washington University unless you have a theory. And so my students have been giving me a hard time about this particular graphic because they say you always pull it out, you use it in every class, but you never published it. Somebody's going to steal it, whatever. Take it if you will. But the bottom line is we operate in all of our work, at least the work I've been engaged with students and colleagues alike, around sort of a cycle of opportunity in our community. And we view this, these relationships as fluid but helpful. So the community both positively and negatively influences what happens in pre-K-12 education and in our formal education settings. What happens in the informal education setting, positive or negative. If it's positive, people continue on into post-secondary education. If it's negative, they often drop out and they end up in prison, needing welfare services. They have health disparities and the like. If they make it to post-secondary education, there's great social capital that unfolds. They build great relationships. They enter the workforce. Once they enter the workforce, they positively impact what happens in the community, and that positively impacts what happens in schools, because all these are financial relationships. Really very important cycle. It's pretty simple. I think it helps guide what we've done, and in each one of these relationships, we attempt to write papers and the like. And then Ferguson happened. And I've been doing this for 13 years, using this as a guide for what I was doing. And I realized once I looked at it how incomplete it really is. And it's incomplete because basically it does not take into consideration something that I had been doing in the previous 10 years of my life, which had been theorizing about race. So I had, in fact, been living two lives, halting between two positions, one in which I spent all of my time theorizing about race, and then another in which I began theorizing about community but had not taken race into consideration. This is really a problem when you're a social scientist, one that has to be resolved when you look at what's happening in a place like St. Louis. And so, I'm here almost in confession. And so the strength of what I had been doing for 13 years was that time and order were accounted for. It's intergenerational. You can watch the cycle of it all unfolding. It's place-based. There's great data on this, census data, school district data. I mean, you can make it cook here, right? Multi-institutional, great sociological work can take place with this. But race is not necessarily a part of it. The limitations, it doesn't deal with social relations at all. It doesn't deal with race in place at all. It doesn't deal with families in context at all. So everything was messed up in my life. And that's when you called me, Joyce. Wow. I was depressed because I thought I knew how to do this. And I was bifurcated in a way that simply was not allowing me to capture what was happening in my own community in the ways that I thought I could. So, I'll be honest with you. I had one of those theological moments, a biblical moment, where I needed to turn to something that would get me through. And so, I turned to the first place that I could think of where I remember race being a salient feature in a conversation about helping other people. And it actually occurs, for me, the one I remember, was in Luke. And it was the Good Samaritan story. And I remembered this, it just vividly came over me that here you had this dreaded half-breed Samaritan who literally reached out to help someone that they really, they had no vested interest in. And all these other people passed them by. Martin Luther King says in his speech about the Good Samaritan story, they passed by because they were fearful of doing what was right. Fearful. And I thought, man, am I that guy? Is that me? Is that the reason I have begun to bifurcate my research in the way I have? Have I gotten scared? Is this Bill Tate choking? And if you think about the definition of what happens there, this is a lawyer trying to justify himself with Christ himself. And he says, what do I have to do to justify myself? He says, go out and do good. Love your neighbor. And then he says, who is my neighbor? And this definition of neighbor is the one that I really want to drive home today. Because there are two definitions that Webster lays out on the term neighbor. One is theological. He says, anybody you can do good for is your neighbor. And the second is, anybody you live close to. And this bifurcation has driven social policy for centuries. The question is, are you just in the business of doing good for other people, or are you just in the business of using your tax dollars for those who benefit, who are most like you, who live close to you? This is the canonical question in American education. It has been and will always be, and I was avoiding it. A neighbor, by definition, is anyone who is in the human race. But the problem in the American story is that everyone born of the womb of a woman is not deemed to be human. So we turn now to some presuppositions. Before we even talk about Ferguson, you got to understand how we define humanity. So my biology friends, they tell me that you have to understand empathy and eugenics. My psychology friends tell me you have to understand reason and moral thinking. My sociology friends tell me you have to understand interactions. If you don't understand these as presuppositions before you get started, then you're going to walk around like I was in a state of depression. So, Bill, what are you talking about? Okay. So what do we know in biology? They've done studies, replicated over and over again with in and out groups. White person, black person. Because we define, and Gloria talked about it yesterday in her social justice speech, sorry, Gloria, justice speech, that we get to self-identify. Some people identify as white. So if you identify as white in these studies, and you see someone take a pencil to the hand, the place where empathy is supposed to go off does not go off. And it works the other way. If you're black, and that's how you self-identify, and you see someone white, take a pencil to the hand, the place in your neurological system that's supposed to go off for empathy doesn't go off. And they've done it with white and Asian and black and Asian. So the Bible, because I'm sorry, I'm being theological today, talks about the flesh. The flesh does not naturally operate in such a way that you're going to do good for somebody who you view as outside of your own group. Don't take it personal. You're hardwired to be jacked up. And if you don't understand that from the beginning, the neurological work, you're already lost. You're going to be walking around talking about why did they do good? They didn't do good because they didn't have any empathy for them. Their brains didn't go off of that. Right? So this is what my psychological friends tell me, my neurological friends tell me this, but we in education, we ignore it. We go around and say teachers ought to do good and counselors ought to do good. They're not made to do good. Right? Okay. Wow. So this is why you can see, I watched the Rodney King video. Some of you might be too young. I watched it, man, my body cringed. Literally, I mean, I was like, dang! Just, I couldn't believe it. And I would be sitting there with some of my white friends, and they'd say, he moved, look, he moved. And he's getting the crap beat out of him, yeah, he moved. And I didn't understand. They couldn't have the same empathy. They weren't hardwired for that. It requires an identity shift. That's why you can see some things, and we have to understand ourselves this way. We're not neurologically hardwired to do this. Professor King wrote an article in 1991. It changed me on disconscious racism. I don't think you had any articles. I looked it up again because, that was one of the first papers I read when I got to the University of Wisconsin. Gloria had to educate me. So I read that paper, and I was looking for the neurological piece, but it wasn't there because that work hadn't been done yet. But in fact, your theorizing was spot on based upon the neurological research. Now we know why you could be disconsciously racist, because you just don't have any empathy. Your neurons aren't firing off. And that's why you can look at Rodney King, or you might look at what happened with Michael Brown, or you might look at some of the things that have been popping up on the internet, and you might not feel it. Similarly, people don't have empathy for some white police officers, some of whom are doing their job appropriately. This is the dilemma we have on the racial front, in and out groups. And then, I just kept moving along trying to figure this thing out, the eugenics movement. Some of you think eugenics is dead. They were forced sterilizing people just a few years ago in one of the states that will go nameless. I'm talking just a few years ago. Forced sterilization. Eugenics is alive and well. And let me say this. People always want to equate the eugenics movement with Nazi Germany and the like. Look, they got that stuff from us. That was done in our foundations. They conceptualized that here. They had contests, theological contests that actually took place in the place I'm from now, St. Louis, where pastors were coming in preaching the gospel of eugenics to churches. This is one of the texts that I found on it. They literally were paying ministers to go around to teach their congregations that it was okay to deal with the feeble-minded and those who didn't have the right cognitive ability, the ability to reason, by sterilization, putting them away. All of these things were happening. And then I thought about it. Every time we call someone dumb or stupid or all these, that's all eugenics coming to life in discourse. So our colleagues who do discourse analysis about what's happening in classrooms, they're really documenting the continuation of eugenics manifested itself in classrooms. You might think I was feeling better after I started figuring this out. I started getting more depressed. Because I realized wrapped up in this was, first I had the neurological, now I got the theological. Man, this regime is quite powerful. Then, of course, we had the science of intelligence. I will not spend much time at AERA talking about that. But I will say this. No one captures this problem more eloquently than Thomas Jefferson in the Notes on the State of Virginia, when he argued quite eloquently that you will never find blacks tracing the thoughts of Euclid, because Jefferson equated that ability to reason with being human. And when you package all of these things together, it reminds me of something that Sylvia Winters said when the Rodney King event was unfolding in L.A. in an op-ed piece to L.A. Times. She basically said the reason you can have police officers going around saying NHI, no humans involved, because they really believe it. They're just not talking. You're not smart. Theology's guiding everything you do. Neurologically, you're set in a certain way. How are you going to have public policy to do good when this is what unfolds? And then, to make it worse, or better, because we're in the business of explanation, Putnam comes out with his work on diversity that calls into question many of the theories that I see still being touted around AERA. Contact theory. The more you're around people who are diverse, the more you're likely to be able to engage with them. And then conflict theory. The more you're around people who are diverse, the more you're likely to have conflict, right? Well, Putnam says both of these things are wrong. And the fact of the matter is, the greater the diversity you have, the lower the social capital, the more distrust that neighbors, including in-groups, have with other in-group members, the withdrawal from friends, less volunteering, less charitable giving, less likely to vote. That's refuting both contact theory and conflict theory. And then he goes on to say, you're more likely to agitate for social reform, but less hopeful about impact. Dang, I had to walk out of the room. That was me. That literally the last one was me. By the way, it might say 11111. That's a weird numerical for my math ed friends. It's really 1, 2, 3. But I realized after doing this, I had come into this space. And if you don't acknowledge where you are as an intellectual, you're doomed. You have to know who you are and where you are. I was in that, I want social reform, but I just couldn't believe it could happen. Space. So I had to readjust my research. And I had to say very carefully to myself that race and the potential effects of biology, psychology, and sociology on opportunity were real, and that the political and geospatial configurations that I examined needed to be recontextualized, that the distribution of education attainment that I had been documented so carefully needed to be recontextualized, that the distribution of affluence and poverty that I had so eloquently done with my GIS work with the help of my colleagues needed to be recontextualized, and that the distribution of health care, which is vitally important for education, also needed to be recontextualized and included. And so I sought to do that, thinking through, because St. Louis is so hyper-segregated, some models that had looked at this, and I'll try to provide data that today that follows partly the script of this, that there are policies that lead to white flight and racial housing discrimination. That leads to segregation. Lower home values and separation from policy influencers follows, which then leads to lower tax bases in place, less funding for education and job training, poor job opportunities, and businesses leave. And then that leads to higher poverty, which leads to poor health outcomes and limited access to health care, and that's linked to poor education. And that's what I had to get back to, because I had left this. And so I was able to, and I hope today, to recontextualize everything we've done in the past 13 years in such a way that I bring together the opportunity discussion with a race and place discussion, and marrying these together. Some of you might call it ecological in nature. I won't go there because the data won't allow me to go there. But I will say this, that I believe I have an appropriate humanistic frame for what I'm attempting to do today. And I will start it with this. This recent Education Next issue actually dealt with family formation. And they had a picture of what appears to be an African-American, almost like a girl, not really a grown woman, and a baby, and then a vanishing picture of a black man. And in all fairness, if you read it, and I read the whole thing, they actually contextualized family formation quite well. The picture that they laid out was quite provocative. It's a 50-year memento, if you will, of the Moynihan Report. They literally walked us through what family formation means for education. I thought it was quite powerful and moving. But I want to stop for a second. Some of you might not know that family that you see on the other side because you're too young or you don't have cable. There's a whole lot of things I focus tested before I got here, but that is the Cleaver family. And that little boy is Beaver Cleaver. Now, you know I must not care because I'm talking about Beaver Cleaver at AERA. All right? And Beaver Cleaver and the Cleaver family were the archetype of the suburban family. That movie, or that whole syndicated series, was started in 1953, came out on CBS. The next year it moved to ABC. The only reason it stopped is because Beaver and his brother Wally got too old. That thing was a hit. Beaver was a rascal. He lied. Man, Beaver skipped school. Beaver and his boys did some work, okay? Beaver was always in trouble. He was adorable, but problematic. Ward, his father, June, prep school graduates, college graduates. June stayed at home and took care of the family. Ward worked at some business. They never talked about what it was, but he went off to the office. And, you know, and he was this Solomon kind of figure. He had all these fables and tales of wisdom and nuggets he would give. It was the image, the very image of the public policy that was manifesting itself in the United States in 1957. Now, you might say, why is this guy talking about Beaver Cleaver? I have a question. It's a simple one. What would happen if Beaver Cleaver was black? And it's 1953. In 1953, according to the FHA, 80,000 blacks in the St. Louis area had sufficient income to move into suburban housing. But because of public policy. This is my boy Beaver, St. Louis style. And if Beaver was really there, unfortunately, he'd be called Beaver locked up. But I want to keep it light for a minute. My boy Beaver was one of the offspring, if we're going to make him a type, he would have been one of the offspring of 80,000 people who could have moved to the suburbs in St. Louis, but were denied because of the machinery that existed in St. Louis. Instead, Beaver had to move, our Beaver, my boy Beaver, I'm just going to call him BB, Black Beaver. BB had to move to Pruitt-Igoe projects, not because they couldn't afford to live somewhere that we call suburban life in St. Louis, because the FHA says they could have moved into Webster Groves. If they moved into Webster Groves, that house today would be worth $500,000. They would have passed that on. They would have paid $1,000 back in the day. It's worth $500,000 now. You know, when I hear people talk about family formation, I want to go back a second. When you have housing policy, it creates economic resources. And economic resources underpin family formation. When people see, the economists say, you're incented to behave in a certain way. If a certain community is not incented to behave in a certain way, you just don't do it. So white communities were incented like Beaver, Cleaver. My boy BB's family had to go to the projects. They got incented in a certain way. But all the conversation, it just seems ahistorical now. We just talk about St. Louis like this stuff didn't happen. The reality is, BB, St. Louis style, got jammed. His family had the money to move to the suburbs. They just didn't allow it. What happened? Well, on the housing side, you had everything under the sun. By the way, Mario Small says all cities where there are lots of poor people, it's a lot in common, largely hard times. But they're different. But the one thing that's the same about St. Louis is that almost every urban city had similar kind of things going on. Racially explicit zoning, restrictive covenants, subsidies to move out like Beaver Cleaver, the first guy did, that was racially exclusive. You had urban renewal, moving people out of reasonable housing. You had the denial of municipal services. Today, if you call an ambulance in North St. Louis, and you're in the wrong part of North St. Louis, it's nobody coming because there's no ambulance service assigned to them. That's still going on now. You had government-supported dual labor markets, annexation strategies that just demolished black communities, and tax incremental financing, which I'll talk about later, especially for my football fans. I'll get to that at the end. So my boy BB has a choice. Basically, his family and all his offspring have to live or go to school in largely segregated St. Louis. No getting around it. Chetty and the economists who have studied this basically says St. Louis is ranked 42nd out of the, and it's in the bottom 10 of places where upper mobility is likely. So if you started in the bottom fifth, the odds of you actually reaching the top fifth in St. Louis is about 5%. That's really quite low. This is what happens when you have what? When you have a regime that creates segregation, that does not promote stable families, that has inadequate schools, there's a lack of social capital as a result, and you have tremendous income inequality. If you reverse those communities actually have great income mobility, and they go really well. Things happen in a positive fashion. Unfortunately, St. Louis and my Beaver didn't have that shot. They had to negotiate something very different. And that's what I want to talk to you about. So what is my Beaver negotiating? My Beaver is negotiating a community. If you go to the northern sector of it, St. Louis City is what you see in orange. They have the highest percentage of households with no credit record, unbanked, very high. And then other parts of the northern suburbs, extremely high unbanked families. This is extremely problematic and tells you the tale of what happened over time. That if you didn't have a chance to actually buy the homes and the things that are necessary to build wealth, you're not even banked now. We get lots of data from our economist friends on wealth, the non-white versus, or the white versus African-American wealth gap has been increasing. Similarly, wealth gap has been increasing for whites versus Hispanics. But you can begin to understand why. I would never put this slide up with a group of students without the information I just provided prior to this. You're absolutely reinforcing the stereotype if you do. If you don't understand that my boy BB and his family were denied, you're just simply saying some group of people are lazy and don't want to work. That's a rhetoric that doesn't even line up with public history. What you'll find in St. Louis, like some of our similar cities, Pittsburgh, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Cincinnati, there are 12 counties, 300 municipalities, 312 local governments, and for every 100,000 people, there are 12 local governments. That's fragmentation by design. This happens because people begin to disperse into municipalities, and they do not want certain kind of people, non-humans as they define them, as neighbors. And so you just bifurcate and just break it off and spin it off, and you get massive fragmentation. By the way, these communities are tanking. This is a way of literally putting an anvil around your region's neck and dropping it into an ocean of abyss. You couldn't have poorer public policy. Poor. And most of the people you talk to who work in the municipalities will tell you they would love to provide more services more broadly. They just can't. They're constricted by these artificial boundaries. Folks, every decade we rewrite boundary lines for municipalities, don't we, for voting? Why can't we do this in some of these really, really, and I'm just keeping it real, jacked up places? Because we simply can't survive like this. America will not survive like this. So what happens with the companies? I highlight Ferguson because I said I would at the beginning. My Beaver and his family live there. The companies aren't in Ferguson. If we look at the largest companies in the area, they're not in Ferguson. No, they're not going there. They're literally on the expressways that are lower. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to do the biotech one. I did this in a presidential talk I did a few years ago. We got tired of dealing with 312 different municipalities and decided we wanted to examine where the biotechnology companies were and create clustering around that. And if you look at this, you can cluster it and really see that the St. Louis Urban Core has a cluster largely around Washington University, St. Louis University, and our medical facilities. And then further out on the expressway, really offshoot companies and related companies that are associated with that, a few to the north, but not many. There's no way really for the people in the northern sector that we're talking about to even engage in, back to the question, indigenous people having access to the major industry that you have going. They're not close, and we don't run a transit system that allows them to get there. So it's transparent to me that these people were not going to be included in the regional economy. So what's going to happen to them? So food, that's a big deal for two reasons. Number one, food service is an industry in which people work, but you need food for cognition. It's a bottom line educational matter, right? Well, when you look at it, the northern sector is full of poor access or no access nutritious retail food scenarios. And, you know, I'm going to take a moment. I don't want to take a shot at my new missionary friends, but if you notice where missionaries want to settle now, the new missionaries are real hip. They want to be in the city where there's Starbucks and Whole Foods. And they just want to kick it, right? And they have everything they need because that's the new mission field, right in the middle of the best land in the city. They're not going out into these upper reaches of some of these suburban areas that have been at risk, and they're certainly not going into rural areas. I think that's really interesting. Who's human here? Who really needs you? Give up Starbucks, give up Whole Foods, and go someplace else. Well, so I'm going to stop for a second and just regroup. I don't know how much time I have. A little bit of time? I'm okay. We started off a bit talking about Michael Brown, so I want to know, if I'm living in St. Louis, what are the factors that are going to lead to me dying prematurely? That young man wasn't 19 years old. What are the factors that lead to it? Well, my behavioral friends in the medical field say there are a few factors that make a difference: your social circumstances, your behavioral patterns, of course, environmental exposure, health care, and genetic predisposition. You can't do anything about genetic predisposition, not necessarily, but all the others are impactful. Thank you. So we know from the literature that whatever money you make as income is highly correlated with your risk for premature death. And if you look at this, I mean, this is as transparent a relationship as you can get. If you're making under $10,000 a year, really high relative risk of death. And if you're making over $100,000 a year, much lower. So income is deeply influential in that. If we think about our St. Louis region, and we have the concentration of African Americans and the concentration of poverty, anything that you see in the bright orange or red, depending if you're colorblind or not, those areas have great risk for premature death. So when you're just thinking about public policy right now, you have to say, wow, there is a field that really we need to deal with. And then it lines up perfectly. So if we look at heart disease rates and cancer rates in these areas by zip code, once again you see the income is highly related to the deaths by heart disease and cancer. And the thing, you might say, what does that have to do with education? Well, if kids are experiencing family members in this situation, it has an impact on what happens to them in the school scenario. We tend to just blow this stuff off. I mean, no contextualization at all about the lives of the kids. I'm a Division G person, so social context means something to me. And you have to pay attention to this. It's hugely impactful. We know that the more education you receive, in fact, it's been changing. High school or less, you gain no years across those two census examinations. But between 1990 and 2000, if you had any college, you gained 1.6 years in life expectancy. And it's actually, many of my colleagues say, going up. So I have said this at many other talks, and I will say it again. It is better to recommend a kid to go to college and flunk out than I recommend them to go to college. Yeah, for all my counselor friends. So it plays out when we look at the data, the zip codes by life expectancy. The northern sector and interior part of St. Louis, 67 years, 70 years in the northern part of the city. The further west you go into the suburbs, the more likely you are to live a longer time. It's just really transparent. Then the question becomes, what can we do about it? And one thing is the health insurance matter. If you look at African Americans under 18 who lack health insurance, it's a little bit higher in St. Louis and St. Louis County. The uninsured rates are higher clearly for African Americans across the board, except for when we get to African Americans and whites over the age of 65, because there's public policy that actually addresses that matter. The others are at risk of not having access to health care. Prenatal care, which anybody who's ever picked up a reasonable psychology book knows that prenatal is a huge deal, and maternal health is a huge deal on cognition and the like. When you look at the inadequacy of health care that's being provided in St. Louis City, the difference is stark. You can't be surprised by the outcomes we get. Every time I see a school accountability graphic in the St. Louis Dispatch, I literally almost throw up because it's so decontextualized, as if none of this is really happening. Really? You tweaked the curriculum? Great. And you expected an effect size? Really? Why? That's more hopeful than you should ever be. we look at the distribution of hospitals, they all cluster around where I work, Washington University. If we look at the distribution of pediatric centers, if you go north, literally pediatricians all stay in the same. If any of you have had kids or you remember going to the pediatrician, remember there were a lot of them in one office. They all share office spaces because they want to be close to one another. Professionals cluster. And the reality is, when you get into the northern part of the city, professionals don't want to cluster there. So what does that mean for kids? That means they don't have pediatricians. That means they don't have access to that. There are no hospitals up there, and you only go up to those hospitals, and they don't have a name on it, so I can say it if you want an aspirin. So the case of North St. Louis, there's a general shortage of healthcare professionals. Approximately a third of the city's population resides in North St. Louis, but only 13% of the physicians have practices located there. There are approximately 25 physicians for every 10,000 North St. Louis residents, 70% fewer than anywhere else. And most of the areas in North St. Louis have fewer than 8 physicians per 10,000 residents. And when their physicians affiliate, if you take out the community health centers and the like, the number goes down to 5 per 10,000. I mean, that's just shocking. Anybody who's dealing with the developmental process would have to look at that and say, it's a miracle that these kids are performing the way they do. It's a miracle. If we look at mental health disorders, you know, it's pretty evenly distributed, but if you go in the northern sector, the rates are a little bit higher for childhood mental health disorders. I bring up this issue because St. Louis in Missouri is the suspension capital of the world. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So if you have a mental health issue, the chances are if you're black, you're going to have to go to the emergency room. That's not really a good strategy. And inpatient hospitalization increases 77% black versus white for mental health conditions for youth under 15 years old. If you're the original Beaver Cleaver, not BB, you have a counselor and some psychiatric help, and you don't go to the hospital or the emergency room, and nobody even knows you have a problem. These kids have to show up and go to the emergency room or be in hospital, put in a hospital because they don't have health care. There are no physicians up there. There's nobody to help them. And then you wonder, when they get to school, why they're in the state they're in. My boy BB is hurting. So they get to school in Missouri. And what do? We put them out. So the Civil Rights Project came up with the data. I just put it in a different format. But Missouri is #1 along with Wisconsin and Indiana. I'm not shocked about Wisconsin and Indiana, but Missouri's #1. 14% of elementary school kids in Missouri are suspended. That's amazing to me. I went to a school where they put the paddle on you, but that's another story. And if we look at the 6 highest school districts that suspend elementary school kids, 3 of them are in St. Louis area. St. Louis Public, Normandy, where Michael Brown attended school, and Riverview Gardens. Both, they're contiguous to one another. That tells me a lot. I understand the experiences. If you don't have this contextualization, you see the stuff and you see CNN coming to Ferguson and people burning up stuff, you wonder why they're burning it up. They should have burned it up a long time ago, they probably thought, right? I'm not inciting a riot here. I'm just saying. Reasons for suspension. The St. Louis Dispatch, and I really have to give a shout out to the St. Louis Dispatch. They've been on point. They literally went and said, so why are all these kids getting suspended? And insubordination, disrespect, a category that relies on subjectivity of a teacher or an administrator. 1,400 elementary school students suspended, 200 kindergartens, and 8 preschoolers. Now I just want you to stop with me for a minute. Think about my boy BB. He's in preschool. He just says, I don't want to go to the Cardinals game. I don't like the Cardinals. I like the Cubs. Suspended, you're gone, you're done, you're out of here. It's a rap, you're disrespectful. Maybe I'm exaggerating. But my point is, look at these numbers. Where does this happen? Then you wonder why people end up in jail. You set it up. This is by design. That's the whole point. Okay. I was trying to avoid the regressions, but this is AERA. So I'm going to say to you for just a moment. Would you want a weather forecast for the state of Missouri? No, what good is that? You're not everywhere all at once. You're not God. You need a weather forecast for St. Louis. You need a weather forecast for Kansas City. You need a weather forecast for whatever municipality you're going into. Most of the time, thank you, Mark, for that metaphor. I'm shouting out to you. Thank you. Most of the time, what we do is we throw everything in a regression equation. Unit of analysis can be the state accountability system. And they're running numbers, and this is a model for the state. That's insane, especially given the techniques we have with GIS. So you can actually get more specific models for locales using geographic weighted regression. It gives you a local weather forecast, if you will, and allows you to look at variation across the state and within the region. And the first rule of geography is things that are close are similar. And so this is a better way of really understanding. And I'm not going to get into all the modeling techniques. You can read some of the papers. But the bottom line is I want to show you a few things. I'm a math ed guy. I need to show you a little math ed. Otherwise, they're going to think I've left math ed, and I haven't. But let's look at the relationship between discipline rate and algebra scores. We've been talking about discipline and mental health issues. And if you look at it, it's interesting. The places where you have statistically significant T-scores is clearly in Ferguson and the St. Louis metro area. The relationship is negative. The higher the discipline rates, the lower the algebra scores. So discipline is actually, at least there's relationships that we need to attend to in that region. But notice the rest of the state, none of this is impactful. That's helpful. Similarly, the percent minority in algebra scores, the places where it's most impactful is clearly the St. Louis region and Kansas City as well, a few areas in the lower part of the state. But it's helpful to understand that. We have, and we used to have something in math and science education called systemic reform, where they went in and tried state policies and regional policies. We need to get back to that, because there are definite differences in what's happening with these modeling techniques in certain regions. Place-based initiatives really matter. Most states now are just throwing out vanilla solutions. They don't work. We have different models going on in these municipalities, and we need to attend to them. Similarly, if we looked at free and reduced lunch and algebra scores, there's a relationship all over the state. Now, I'm going to stop for a second. There should be a coalition of people dealing with poverty in the state of Missouri, urban and suburban and rural, that should be dealing with this. And it used to be talked about, but people gave up on it because you know why? Because the in and out group, black, white, kept people from viewing one another as human. But the reality is we have a lot in common when we deal on this poverty issue. It's a scissors. The poorer you are, the worse things are for you. We have something in common. Free and reduced lunch and graduation rate, clearly impactful in our St. Louis region, negative relationships there. And free and reduced lunch and dropout, not surprising at all, serious relationships. I'm going to just say one thing. How come every one of you is in the state with accountability functions going on? The level of work that goes on in that is almost like Disneyland. It's embarrassing. This is America. We can dig deeper into those models and really find out what's going on in these communities and have action plans. We simply don't do it. And the analytical work it's almost like arithmetic being presented. So, in the little time that I have left, and I'm supposed to give you some time to ask questions, because the spirit is moving, people have tried different things to help make things better. I don't want you to think that people in St. Louis didn't try or more national efforts didn't. So there was a push for regionalism. 1962, there was a borough plan that was put forth that would have allowed the municipalities to converge and have boroughs. 2 people would be elected per borough. There'd still be a mayor. They would run it, and you would have a big landmass. And I want you to always remember something. The bigger the landmass, the more tax revenue you take in, the more sharing possibilities that are feasible. Right now, what happens in St. Louis, if a company wants to come, we compete against each other to get the company. The company is the one that wins, and the people who lose out in the bidding, they lose the tax revenue as well. So the really smart cities have big landmass boxes. They don't compete against one another. They've made a decision to share the tax revenue. That's what they were trying to do in St. Louis. Every international study I've ever seen says that if you can shrink the number of municipalities, you increase the labor market productivity significantly, which changes the life course of people. But you have to get off of being stuck on stupid. This didn't pass. To their credit, the St. Louis Dispatch ran this article a few weeks ago begging the community to revisit regionalism again. If we don't, we're literally going to suck into the Mississippi River. 100 years from now, 150 years from now, what we call St. Louis will not be the same. People need to understand, and it's not just St. Louis. We've had interventions on the segregation order. Everybody knows about Brown. We had the Liddell case. The Liddell case created an interdistrict busing, which led to the largest interdistrict desegregation program in the United States. Largely, I would say it was impactful in a positive way. It seemed to work. Unfortunately, like most other desegregation plans, the state funding ended. It became voluntary. Some municipalities stayed in it. I think they've had some good developmental outcomes, but others did not, and those kids are now stuck in the situations they're stuck in. And so it's a positive story, but a sad one because something was working, but then it was pulled out and the resources were taken away. Subsequent to that, there were laws put into place that if your school district lost accreditation, you would have a right to petition to go to a school district that was basically contiguous to yours. And the irony is, in St. Louis, on this case, it was actually a white family in the city of St. Louis that sued to be able to allow their kid to leave the St. Louis public schools and go to the Clayton public schools. That's the Turner case, which my colleagues and I, some of the students and I have written about. Well, I can only describe it to you like this. After the back and forth with the court scenario, they had 1 year where they were able to implement this, and the incentives for people to keep kids out of their schools played out in ways that just mirror Economics 101. And so many young people were basically put in situations where they would have to ride a bus miles upon miles instead of closer districts accepting them. It was really a nightmare. Many of the students went out to see some of the protests that were happening in the receiving districts, and what they described to me sounded very much like some of the descriptions I've heard of 1950 rallies related to desegregation. Volatile, angry parents. And I have to say this because I get to do this in my talk. And I'm going to say this to my friends whose kids live in a suburban life. Look, I read applications at Washington University, and every one of the young people, they go on mission trips to Haiti. Man, they're saving the world. I mean, they're killing it. Every single one, the litany of descriptions of these suburban kids and the things that they actually are afforded to do, which, by the way, Putnam says we're dumping hundreds of millions of dollars into our kids for all of these social capital development activities. hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars per year. That's why people get married, because they want to invest in that. And then you have an opportunity to take a neighbor into your school district and you turn it into a Klan rally. I don't understand it. I don't understand why you would pretend like your kid, you know, these people aren't your neighbors. I don't get it. These are the same people who applied with these CVs you wouldn't believe. That's hypocrisy. And we have session after session where we're telling kids, yeah, get your kids involved, get them active. The first activity was to say, you know what, we can do good for those people that live right down the street from us. But we're not going to do that. That's what I'm talking about. This stuff is crazy. I stopped getting depressed, I started getting mad. So, here's the current situation, well, reasonably current situation with the accredited school districts. Michael Brown attended, he went to the Normandy schools. They're not accredited, unaccredited. I don't have time to explain to you the absolute. If you looked at the accreditation modeling scheme as educators and ask yourself, on what basis, what's the predictability of the framing that they put together? You would sit there and just be stunned, like, well, it just looks like a bunch of people got in the room and threw some indicators together, because that's exactly what happened. And so folks who are unaccredited and what have you, I don't know what that means. People, I've tried to explain this to the newspaper people. They just don't understand. They think it's a number because you make it a number, and that means it's neutral and valid and all of that. But this stuff, there's nobody writing about it. And I was so excited that Jeannie is following up next year talking about public intellectualism. We need to be writing about this stuff. Some of this stuff is just tomfoolery. But there are no papers out there. You don't see AERA people writing about it in the local newspapers, nothing. You're stuck in AERJ, if you can get there. So I don't know what these things mean other than those kids are stuck in schools, basically they say are not functioning well, and they can't transfer out. Very quickly, the other thing we do, so I meant to give a shout out to my divisions. Regionalism is really about Division G, and then accountability is really my Division L people. You know, they love that stuff, and a few people in measurement and evaluation, they love all of that. I'm going to leave them for that one. And then we have my people, my math ed people and my policy people, the division, I'll call them L, and some division C, where they basically say, what all we need to do, by golly, is increase the cognitive demand for every young person that is getting out of high school. And if we do that, we're going to make sure they really learn math and science. That's what's going to happen. But there are unintended consequences for your behavior. And if you start looking at it systematically, you'll see that, and we did it actually because state policies were changing in the 1990s, and I'm going to go fast, 1980s with the nation at risk through the year 2000, where any one of the states you see here, I think you see the numbers, the darker, where the pink is 0 math and science credits required for high school, and the dark green is 6. And you have to ask yourself, the intended consequence is more kids will graduate from high school better prepared to go to college. The unintended consequences are they might drop out because they're not prepared, because you did jack in elementary school to get them ready, right? All you did was mandate that they were going to have to take more courses. You didn't change the elementary school. You did nothing for them. I already told you they're suspending these kids like 40 going north. Everything's jacked up down there, rolling. It's an ecological nightmare. And then you archaeological dig on top of that a mandate like this. And so if we look at high school dropout, college dropout, any college, what you see, not surprising, blacks are the highest demographic dropout rate across the demographic group. Black men is their number one. But the large impact, in the study we looked at, over 2.5 million young people, the increase in dropout rate when you had the highest levels of requirements in math and science was 1.07 increase. That's huge if you put a cost benefit on that from a financial point of view. Massive amount of money. The greatest increases were observed in black and Hispanic men. So my boy BB was in a world of trouble when we mandated all this stuff. He had no help in the lower grades, and you just threw this on top of him. There's no significant changes in terms of college enrollment in the larger sample. Some subgroups had a decrease in attendance. Hispanic men and Hispanic women had a decrease. The probability of some college completing the college degree increased a small bit. So if you could survive the policy, you had a little larger chance of actually getting out. Why am I bringing this up? Because oftentimes at the state level, the policy solutions for a place like Ferguson or any place else is we're just going to mandate a bunch of really good things for them. But in Missouri, there's something called the Hancock provision, which means you can't raise the taxes, you can't get more revenue for these things. So you just mandate their unfunded mandates. There's no support. So my psychological state. The last issue I had was Medicare or Medicaid expansion for kids. If you remember that, that was what I said. And when Joyce called me, I was working on an op-ed piece for the St. Louis Dispatch. I wrote the op-ed piece. It sat in my draft box file. I didn't send it. I was hopeless. I want to share it with you sort of to conclude my remarks. My ear hurts. It's hard to breathe. I feel sad, and it won't go away. Imagine learning to read or doing math with ear pain or asthma. Picture taking a big test while experiencing a state of depression. Many students miss school, experience increased severity of illness that go untreated because they cannot afford a health care provider. Like families, educators are on the front lines of child and adolescent health. Too many students do not have health care coverage. The U.S. Census Bureau estimated that almost 10% of children under 19, almost 8 million, were without health insurance. St. Louis City and St. Louis County contribute more than 13,000 youth to this national problem. This may seem to be an insignificant number. However, think about it in relation to the famous St. Louis question: what high school did you attend? That's the big sociological question there. The uninsured figure is roughly equal to the enrollment of 6.5 Lafayette high schools, 7 Melville high schools, or 13 Clayton high schools. None of these communities would view this as acceptable. Our region should not accept this state of affairs. Insured children do better in school. In a May National Bureau of Economic Research working paper, Sarah Cohorts and her colleagues reported that the expansion of public health care in the form of Medicaid reduced high school dropout rates, increased college attendance, and improved the rate of college degrees earned. Childhood illness placed students at greater risk for lower school performance, including greater likelihood of school dropout. Compared to those with lower dropout rates, St. Louisans with more education are less likely to have health problems, to smoke, or to be obese. The influence of education on health is a particular concern for African Americans in the St. Louis region. In 2012, according to the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, over 2,000 African American 9 through 12 graders were classified as high school dropouts in St. Louis City and St. Louis County. That's just 1 year. 1 in 10 African American ninth graders were classified as high school dropouts in the region. Unless they resume their education, this places them at high risk for both lower incomes and poorer health. These students were likely to earn about $7,000 less per year than high school graduates. Envision a region with increased purchasing power ranging anywhere from $340,000 to $739,000 per graduate, higher tax receipts to support services in schools, and lower costs for social services and unemployment assistance. Using earnings estimates alone, St. Louis gains over nearly $7 million to $1.5 billion across a generation if the 2012 African American cohort completed high school. Think about the effect year after year. Visualize 13 Clayton High Schools worth of children with health insurance coverage and expanded access to school-based health support. Many more St. Louisans would live longer and get to answer a different question: where did you graduate from high school? I'm going to end with this. I grew up not far from here on 35th Street, 3510 South Rhodes, Bronzeville, low end. And I will remember being 12 years old or so, and my mother getting in the car saying, I'm going to take you to the closest boys club for you to participate like you should as a young man. She got in the car and drove straight across 35th Street, across the Dan Ryan, past Comiskey Park, into Bridgeport. We get out of the car, go in. The whole way I'm saying, you're crazy, Mom. What are we doing here? She just kept saying, you just got to try. So we go in, we ask to join. And I don't know how many of you understand Chicago, but Bridgeport in the 1970s was a hostile community to African Americans, and I think still to this day. And we go in, the man was very kind. He said, ma'am, I know you're mistaken. This is not where you're not from this neighborhood. You're not human. That's what he was saying. And he said, you need to go to the YMCA on the west side, which was the Henry Horner homes, a long way away from where I lived. And if you're from the south side, you tended not to go to the west side. But we did. And I pondered that as I was working on this, my own experience with sort of place-based, race-based, zip code-based opportunity. And I just have one thing to say to you. Go out and do good. Thank you.